The world was going white, and Sarah Wickham was disappearing right along with it. Snow fell in a thick, silent sheet, burying the town of Dry Creek under a blanket of forgetting. It muffled the sound of doors being bolted, of families gathering by warm fires, of a world that had a place for everyone but her. The hem of her thin wool dress, already frayed from a life of hard work, was now gathering a cruel lace of frost. She kept walking. She didn't look back. There was nothing to see. Just hours ago, she'd had a home, a life, a husband. Now Elijah was in the frozen ground, and she was on the road with nothing but the clothes on her back and a cold that was sinking straight into her bones. Her mother-in-law, Millicent Greaves, had made sure of that. The woman's voice was as sharp and sour as vinegar. She had stood in the doorway of the home Sarah had shared with Elijah, a Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon. "He's gone," Millicent had hissed, her eyes like chips of ice. "That means you're gone too. You're not kin, you're just something he dragged home." Millicent had shoved a small, pathetic parcel of Sarah's belongings into her arms and slammed the door. The click of the latch was louder than a gunshot. It was the sound of her life ending. A man on horseback rode past, his face a brief question in the falling dusk, before he spurred his horse on, eager to get away from the sight of her. A lone woman on the road after dark. A widow. She was a story that could only end one way in a town like Dry Creek. Badly. Her toes were numb. Her cheeks burned. The cold was a physical thing, a heavy hand pressing down on her, trying to snuff out the last flicker of her life. She was about to give up, to just lie down in the snow and let it take her, when she saw it. A cabin. It was crouched at the edge of the woods, almost swallowed by the trees, like a secret the forest was trying to keep. A faint curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. There was no path, no welcome mat, just the faint promise of warmth in a world that had gone completely cold. This was a fool's errand. She knew it. Everyone in Dry Creek whispered about the man who lived there. They called him Chaza. They said he was an Apache, a scout, a man who had seen and done terrible things. They called him a savage, a hermit, dangerous. But they also told other stories. Whispers of him lifting a fallen plow horse with his bare hands, of him never raising his voice to a woman or telling a lie, of lost children who wandered too close to his woods and came back safe, with their pockets full of wild berries. Sarah stood there 10 feet from the door, the snow piling up around her ankles. She could freeze to death under the town bridge, or she could knock on the door of a man they called a monster. Her knuckles, stiff and blue with cold, rapped against the heavy wood before she even decided to move. Once, twice, a third time. Silence. The only sound was the wind and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She was about to turn away, to accept her fate, when the door creaked open. Firelight spilled out, painting the snow orange. And in the doorway, a silhouette. He was tall, impossibly so, his shoulders broad and his chest bare despite the freezing cold. The firelight danced across skin that was the color of rich earth, illuminating a road map of old scars. His black hair was long and loose, falling to his shoulders. And his eyes, they were dark. So dark she couldn't read a single thing in them. No surprise, no anger, just a deep, unnerving presence. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She managed, her voice a pathetic croak. My in-laws threw me out." He said nothing. He just watched her, his expression as still and unmoving as the ancient pines behind him. "I don't mean to be a bother," she stammered, the cold making her teeth chatter. "I'll leave in the morning. I just need a place to—" She couldn't finish. The fight went out of her, and she just stood there, a broken thing on his doorstep. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside, a silent invitation. His voice, when it finally came, was as low and deep as the rumbling earth. "Welcome." She stumbled inside, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow, like a mercy she hadn't realized she was praying for. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was clean. A fire blazed in the hearth, and a pot of something that smelled rich and savory bubbled over the flames. She stood awkwardly by the door, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, until he gestured with his head toward a simple wooden bench. She sank onto it, her legs giving out from under her. He disappeared for a moment, and returned with a thick, heavy blanket woven from dark wool. He didn't wrap it around her shoulders like some gentle hero in a storybook. He just handed it to her, a simple, practical offering. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling it tight around herself. The warmth was immediate, a shock to her frozen skin. He sat on a low stool across from her, by the fire, and picked up a piece of leather he'd been working on. He began carving into it with a small, sharp knife, his hands steady and sure. He didn't look at her again. The silence wasn't hostile, though. It was full, like the deep, quiet hush of a forest under a heavy snow. It was a silence that held things, that didn't need to be filled with nervous chatter. Her eyes stung, and she wasn't sure if it was from the biting wind she'd just escaped or from a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost knocked her over. "I'm Sarah," she said, needing to say something, to anchor herself in this strange, quiet world. A beat passed. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of his knife on the leather. "Chaza," he said, without looking up. She nodded, as if filing the name away. "You live far out." He didn't answer that. Outside, the storm grew angrier, its claws scrabbling at the windows. A wolf howled somewhere deep in the woods, a long, lonely sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Despite the fear, she felt a strange kinship with the sound. Lonely, outcast. She glanced at the bubbling pot. "Is that for supper?" "Yes." "Do you mind if I stay?" The question was absurd. She was already here. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so faint she almost missed it. "You already are." And just like that, a real smile, shaky and unfamiliar, found its way to her own face. It was the first time she had smiled in weeks, maybe months. It felt like a muscle she'd forgotten how to use. "I'll help," she offered, suddenly needing to be useful, to earn this sanctuary. "I can cook. I can mend. I know how to gut a fish and read the weather." He finally looked up from his work, his dark eyes meeting hers across the firelit space, and in their depths, something flickered. It wasn't pity. It wasn't kindness. It was recognition. Or maybe just the reflection of the flames. "We'll see," he said, and went back to his carving. That night, she slept on the bench by the fire, wrapped in his blanket. He slept on the floor near the door, a hand resting near a small, wicked-looking hatchet he kept beside him. She watched him for a long time in the flickering firelight. His face, even in sleep, wasn't peaceful. It was just still. It was the face of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to ever truly rest. The wind howled, rattling the walls of the small cabin, but for the first time since she'd watched them lower Elijah's coffin into the hard, frozen earth, Sarah didn't feel like she was about to be blown away. She felt anchored. She didn't know what would happen in the morning. Maybe he'd tell her to leave. Maybe the town, full of its righteous fury, would come looking for her. Maybe this fragile peace was just a short reprieve before the end. But for now, the walls held, the fire burned bright, and she was safe. She drifted off to sleep, not with hope, exactly, but with a deep, profound sense of rest. And for a woman who had lost everything, that was more than enough. But as she slept, she couldn't shake a strange, nagging feeling. Why had he let her in so easily? The town called him a savage, a recluse who wanted nothing to do with their world. Yet, he had opened his door to a stranger without a single question. It didn't make sense. And in the wild, silent heart of Dry Creek, things that didn't make sense usually meant trouble was coming. When Sarah woke, the world was still white. Frost had painted delicate, intricate patterns on the single window pane, blurring the line between inside and out. Her back ached from the hard bench, but the blanket was still warm, and the air was thick with the comforting smells of wood smoke and leftover stew. Chaza was gone. The cabin was silent, except for the soft whisper and pop of the fire he must have tended before he left. She rose slowly, her feet wincing as they touched the cold floorboards. The stew pot was sitting by the hearth, cold but untouched from the night before. She ladled some into a wooden bowl and ate, huddled by the fire, each spoonful a small act of defiance against the emptiness in her belly and her heart. The door creaked open, and he entered as silently as a shadow. Snow dusted his broad shoulders and clung to his dark hair. He was carrying a massive armful of firewood, cradled against his bare chest as if the freezing cold was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. He glanced at her, then at the empty bowl, and gave a single, curt nod. "You stayed," he said. It wasn't a question. "I said I would," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. That was the extent of their conversation for hours. They moved around the small cabin in a strange, silent dance. She found a worn broom and swept the floors, tidied the small collection of pots and pans, and washed their bowls in a bucket of melted snow. He sat by the window, the winter light catching the sharp planes of his face, and worked on his leather straps, a knife glinting in his skilled hands. They were like two ghosts from different worlds, haunting the same small space, careful not to disturb the other's quiet. Around noon, the wind picked up again, whistling through the pines with a mournful sound that made her jump. Chaza looked up from his work. Without a word, he stood, opened a large wooden chest in the corner, and pulled out a coat. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen. It was made of thick hide lined with fur and decorated with intricate patterns of hand-sewn beads, an Apache coat. He held it out to her. She just stared at it. "You don't have to do that. You'll need it," was his only reply. She took it, her fingers brushing against his for a fraction of a second. His skin was warm despite the cold. The coat was heavy, imbued with the faint, wild scent of him, of leather and wood smoke and something else she couldn't name. It felt like a shield. Later that afternoon, she found herself outside, helping him stack the firewood he'd brought in. The snow was falling in lazy, gentle spirals now, a stark contrast to the biting fury of the previous night. He passed her the heavy logs without a word, and she took them, arranging them in a neat, tight row against the cabin wall. The work was hard, and her muscles, unused to such labor, screamed in protest. But it was a good ache, an ache that meant she was alive, that she was useful. It was an ache that pushed out the despair. As she was scrubbing the stew pot later, her hands red and raw from the cold water, she glanced over at him. "You haven't asked," she said, her voice quiet. He didn't look up from the bridle he was mending. "Asked what?" "Why I'm here, what happened with my husband, why his mother cast me out like trash." The words came out in a rush, bitter and sharp. Chaza's hands stilled. He set the leather down and finally, slowly, looked at her. His dark eyes were steady, holding hers. "I don't need to know things that already hurt you," he said. The air left Sarah's lungs in a quiet whoosh. No one in her entire life had ever said anything so clean, so simple, so profoundly kind without a hint of pity. She turned back to the pot, blinking furiously, as a single hot tear fell from her eye and sizzled in the soapy water. It was a tear for the kindness she'd never known she was missing. That night, they ate supper together, at the same small table, 2 bowls of stew, 2 spoons, 2 silent people sharing a meal. He didn't push her to talk, but the silence felt inviting, safe. And so, she spoke. She told him about the little things, about the way the house she'd shared with Elijah never truly felt like her own, about the long, heavy silences that had swallowed up their love long before a falling tree had crushed his body. She spoke of a man who was good, but weak, a man who had died so suddenly she never had a chance to say goodbye, or to ask him why he'd let his mother's bitterness poison their home. She didn't talk about Millicent by name. She didn't need to. The venom was implied in every word. Chaza listened. He just listened, the way the ancient earth listens, patient, still, absorbing it all without judgment. "I was married for 4 years," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper, "and he never once looked at me the way you look at that fire." Chaz's gaze didn't waver from the flames. He said nothing. She let out a short, brittle laugh. "Sorry, that was a foolish thing to say." "No," he said, his voice low and firm. "It wasn't." The next day he was gone before she woke. The cabin felt colder, emptier, but on the table, a piece of scrap paper was weighted down by a smooth stone. On it, written in a blocky, unfamiliar hand, were 3 words, "Back by dusk," and underneath, another line, "Don't open to anyone." Sarah stared at the note for a long, long time. Alone in the quiet cabin, a different kind of fear began to creep in. Not the fear of freezing, but the fear of the unknown. She kept busy, forcing the feeling down. She refilled the wood bin, mended a small tear in the curtain, and chopped the last of the carrots for a new stew. As the sun began to sink, casting long purple shadows across the snow, she stepped outside to gather more snow for water. And that's when she saw them. Footprints. They weren't hers. They weren't Chaza's. There were 3 sets of them, heavy boot prints leading out of the woods, straight toward the cabin. But they stopped short, maybe 50 feet away, before veering off and disappearing back into the trees. They had been watching the cabin. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled back inside, bolting the heavy wooden door. She grabbed the heaviest skillet she could find and stood with her back to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting. Dusk fell, and the cabin grew dark. Just as true fear began to set in, she heard the soft crunch of a single set of footsteps outside. Chaza's steps. He entered slowly, his eyes immediately taking in her panicked stance, the skillet held like a weapon. He didn't look surprised. He just lifted his empty palms in a placating gesture. "Someone was here," she whispered, her voice trembling. He dropped a heavy satchel of supplies on the floor and walked to the window, peering out into the deepening gloom. "I know," he said, his voice grim. "They're watching." "Who?" "Men from town. Maybe more." He turned to face her, and there was no fear in his eyes, only a hard, steady resolve that chilled her even more than the footprints had. "They think you've gone wild, that you're with a savage now." He paused, his gaze intense. "And that makes you something they think they have the right to punish." Her mouth went dry. The threat wasn't just whispers and glares in town anymore. It had followed her here. It was outside her door. "Will they come back?" she asked, her voice small. "Maybe," he said, his eyes scanning the tree line again. "But not while it storms." That night, the wind howled like a hungry beast, and the branches of the pines clawed at the roof. Sarah didn't sleep on the bench. Chaza gave her his own bed, a thick straw mattress piled with warm, heavy pelts, and he took his place by the door again, his hand resting on the smooth, worn handle of his hatchet. She lay awake for hours, watching his still form, a silent guardian in the dark. He was a part of this wild land, carved from its rock and hardened by its storms, and as she watched him, a feeling stirred in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was something fierce, something protective. It was the terrifying, undeniable realization that she would not run, not anymore. Not when the snow melted, not ever. Just before dawn, he stirred, his eyes opening in the dim light. He saw her watching him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft in the pre-dawn quiet. "For not asking questions, for just letting me be." He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her, not just a stray woman he'd taken in from the cold. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Everyone's got something they're carrying," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't need to know what's in your pack to help you carry the weight." And there it was, not a declaration of love, not a flowery promise, but something truer, something solid. A vow made in the quiet space between two broken people, lit by the embers of a dying fire. Outside, The snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the tracks of the men who had come to watch. It was a clean slate. But Sarah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that the pristine white snow wouldn't stay clean for long. The calm was a lie, and the storm that was coming had nothing to do with the weather. The snow finally stopped, and the world was left dazzling and bright, shimmering under a pale winter sun. Sarah walked beside Chaza on the main trail into Dry Creek, and for the first time, she wasn't shrinking. She wore the beaded Apache coat he'd given her like a suit of armor. Her hair was neatly braided, her chin was held high, and her steps were firm. Every step closer to town made her stomach twist into a tight, painful knot, but she didn't let it show. He hadn't asked her to come. She had insisted. If they were to face this, they would face it together. They passed a family in a wagon. The father stared, his face a mask of disapproval. The mother clutched her shawl tighter and pulled her young son closer, as if Sarah and Chaza were a contagion. Sarah felt the heat of shame rise in her cheeks, but Chaza didn't even seem to notice. He just kept walking, his face as unreadable as a stone carving. She straightened her spine and walked on. The bell on the general store door jangled loudly as they entered, announcing their arrival to the hushed interior. The sudden warmth was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and unspoken judgment. Mr. Pewitt, the portly storekeeper, looked up from behind his counter, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before settling into a hostile glare. "Help you?" he grunted. Chaza stepped forward and placed a neatly tied bundle of prime beaver pelts on the counter. "Trade," he said, his voice even. Mr. Pewitt eyed the bundle, but didn't move to touch it. He just stood there, scratching his neck, a smug look on his face. Sarah stepped up beside Chaza, her presence a silent statement of unity. "We need flour," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And soap. And apples, if you have any left that are good." Pewitt's eyes narrowed, flicking from her to Chaza and back again. "Store's closed for fur trading today," he muttered, not meeting their eyes. Chaza's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "That's a new policy," Sarah challenged. "There's no sign." "Don't need one," Pewitt sneered. "It's my store." Sarah didn't flinch. She reached into the pocket of the heavy coat and pulled out the handful of coins Chaza had given her before they left. She placed them on the counter with a firm click. The sound seemed to echo in the silent store. "Then I'm paying," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "And he's with me." The air in the store grew thick and heavy. A boy stocking shelves in the back froze, his eyes wide. Pewitt's jaw worked silently, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looked from the coins to Chaza's unmoving form, a silent, intimidating mountain of a man. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like defeat, he gave in. "Fine," he grumbled, gesturing with his head. "Apples are in the bin by the window." Sarah turned, her back straight, and filled a small cloth bag with 4 of the best apples she could find, soft but not yet bruised. She gathered a sack of flour and a bar of lye soap, then returned to the counter. Chaza hadn't moved an inch. His presence alone was a challenge, a silent defiance that the entire town could feel. Pewitt bagged her items sullenly, refusing to look at either of them. As they left, the bell on the door jangled again, this time sounding sharp and angry, like a rebuke. Outside in the cold, bright air, Sarah's hand tightened around the parcel. The anger and humiliation were a bitter taste in her mouth. "They hate us," she said, the words coming out as a shaky whisper. "No," Chaza replied, his voice calm and low. "They fear us. They fear anything they don't understand." He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious. "You didn't say anything back there," she noted, thinking of how he'd let her take the lead. "I never waste breath on rotting wood," he said simply. "Better to save it for building with the strong." That night, she baked the apples. She peeled them with painstaking care, sliced them into thin, perfect slivers, and laid them in a skillet with a dusting of sugar and the last of the cinnamon she'd hoarded since autumn. The sweet, warm scent filled the small cabin, a fragrant ghost of comfort and home. She placed the plate of warm, caramelized apples on the table before him. He looked down at it for a long moment, his face unreadable in the firelight. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice soft. "You didn't have to take me in," she replied. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. The ice between them was finally, truly beginning to melt. She watched him take a bite, then another. He ate slowly, thoughtfully, as if he hadn't tasted anything sweet in a very long time. But their small moment of peace was about to be shattered. Later that week, it happened. It was close to midnight, the cabin quiet except for the pop of the fire and the sound of the wind. Suddenly, a crash. The sound of shattering glass. A rock flew through the window, trailing a blast of icy air, and landed with a thud on the floor. Sarah screamed, a raw, terrified sound. Chaza moved faster than she could blink. In one fluid motion, he was on his feet, hatchet in hand, and throwing open the door to stare into the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the silent, watching trees and fresh footprints in the snow, already fading. He didn't have to look far for the message, painted in crude, dripping letters on the trunk of a large pine tree right outside the cabin, were the words, "Savages don't get settler brides." Chaza stood there for a long time, shirtless in the biting cold, staring at the words. His fists were clenched at his sides, his body rigid with a fury so profound it seemed to make the very air around him vibrate. Sarah crept to his side, pulling a quilt around her shoulders, her breath coming in quick, panicked clouds. "They'll be back," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He gave a single sharp nod. His eyes were fixed on the darkness where the men had fled. A terrible, cold fear gripped her. Do you want me to go?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I could leave. It would be safer for you." His answer wasn't in words, it was in action. He turned, went back inside, and grabbed a hammer and some thick planks of wood. By the dim light of a single lantern, he began to board up the broken window, each nail driven home with a steady, deliberate, and terrifying force. Each strike of the hammer was a promise, an act of war. When he was done, he turned to her, his face a mask of grim determination in the flickering light. "You don't run from a fire," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You tend it, and you make damn sure anyone who tries to put it out gets burned." Sarah stared at him, at the raw power radiating from him, and she knew. This wasn't just about her anymore. They had threatened his home, his sanctuary. They had woken something up inside him, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. And the men who had thrown that rock had no idea what kind of monster they had just unleashed. The days that followed were taut with a new kind of tension. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by a watchful, waiting silence. Sarah no longer felt like a guest. She felt like a soldier. She stopped asking for permission and started taking initiative. She chopped wood alongside him, her swings clumsy, but filled with a fierce determination. She learned to track, to read the signs of the forest, to listen to the language of the wind in the trees. One morning she found a small, perfect circle of smooth white stones arranged on the table, a silent gesture. She would learn later that it was an Apache symbol of protection, a ward against evil, a promise that he would keep her safe. The snows deepened, but instead of feeling trapped, Sarah felt fortified. The cabin was no longer a temporary shelter, it was a fortress, and Chaza was no longer a stranger, he was her garrison. One afternoon, as she was mending a tear in his only winter shirt, she spoke without thinking, the words tumbling out into the quiet air. "I used to want children." Chaza, who was sharpening the blade of his hatchet, paused. His hands stilled. "I used to dream of it," she continued, her voice low and wistful, "of holding something that needed me, something that would know me and love me without reservation." She thought of Millicent's cruel words, of being called useless and barren. He didn't offer empty platitudes or cheap sympathy. He never did. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes dark and serious, and said, "You still could." Her own eyes filled with tears. I thought I was broken, that I couldn't. Thoughts are not truths," he said, his voice firm. "They are just clouds passing in front of the sun." She looked at him then, truly looked at him. Not as a savior, not as a dangerous hermit, but as a man whose hands were strong enough to build a new world from scratch, and whose scars proved he had already paid the price for the old one. He was the truest, most solid thing she had ever known. That night, a storm rolled in, a monster of wind and snow that seemed determined to rip the cabin from its very foundations. One moment, the stars were glittering like diamond dust on black velvet. The next, the wind was screaming like a banshee, throwing snow sideways in blinding sheets. Chaza was already outside, a shirtless phantom in the swirling chaos, checking the roof, securing the small lean-to where he kept his horse. Without a second thought, Sarah threw on the beaded coat and ran out after him, plunging into snowdrifts up to her knees. "You should be inside!" he yelled over the roar of the wind, his face sharp with concern and cold. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," she yelled back, grabbing the second ladder. She scrambled up the other side of the roof, her knuckles burning on the icy rungs, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy. It was terrifying and foolish and the most alive she had ever felt. He met her at the peak, both of them kneeling in a foot of fresh powder. "Hold this!" he commanded, handing her the edge of a heavy tarp. Their hands brushed, and in the frozen chaos, a spark of heat passed between them. They worked in a desperate, unspoken rhythm, pulling, tying, their movements synchronized as they fought to tame the storm. When the last corner was secured, he turned to her. She was panting, her cheeks flushed a brilliant red, her eyes bright and defiant against the onslaught of the wind. "You could have stayed warm by the fire," he said, his voice softer now. She shook her head, a wild smile touching her lips. "I chose not to." Later, huddled by the fire, wrapped in quilts, the storm still raging outside, she watched the flames dance in his dark hair. She felt a tremor run through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "People in town don't understand you," she said quietly. "They don't need to," he replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I didn't either," she admitted. "Not at first. I saw what they saw, a savage, a hermit." She paused. "But now I see what you don't say. That you're not cold, you're just quiet. You're not hard, you're just alone." Chaza didn't move, but she saw a subtle shift in his posture, a slight softening of the rigid lines of his shoulders. "I think I've been all of those things too," she whispered. The next morning, the world was encased in ice, every branch and twig coated in a thick layer of glistening frost. They walked into town again, a united front against the coming battle. Sarah wore the beaded coat like a queen wears her robes, her head held high. The whispers followed them like ghosts, the glares were like daggers, but she didn't flinch. One man spat in the dirt as they passed. She met his eyes until he looked away. They were at the blacksmith's, Chaza negotiating for nails and hinges, when a voice cut through the air like a whip. "Well, well, I suppose a hard winter makes for strange bedfellows." It was Millicent Greaves. She stood there, her face pinched and sour, her bonnet pulled so tight it seemed to be strangling her. Sarah turned to face her former mother-in-law. "Don't, Millicent," she warned, her voice low. Millicent let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Don't what? Tell the truth? You think hiding out in the woods with a savage makes you decent? Makes you whole?" Her voice dripped with venom. "You were broken long before my Elijah died. You were born useless." Chaza's hands, which had been resting on the counter, balled into fists. But before he could speak, Sarah took a step forward. She inhaled slowly, her gaze locking with Millicent's. "I was broken," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell, "when I let you define me, when I let you tell me what I was worth. Millicent scoffed. You're worth nothing. You're a barren, empty thing. I was, Sarah said, and the word hung in the air. Now I'm not. She took another step closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. And if I am ever blessed enough to be a mother, I will be nothing like you. The color drained from Millicent's face. Her own cruelty seemed to have struck her speechless. You won't be a mother, she finally spat. Not with him. That's when Chaza moved. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply stepped forward, placing his tall, powerful frame between Sarah and Millicent. A silent, immovable wall. He didn't threaten. He just was, and his presence was more intimidating than any weapon. The blacksmith, eager to end the confrontation, cleared his throat loudly and pushed a heavy sack across the counter. That'll be all, he said, his voice strained. Sarah took the sack, her hand brushing against Chaza's sleeve as she turned to leave. They walked away without a backward glance, leaving Millicent standing there, small and sputtering in their wake. That night, back in the safety of the cabin, the tears finally came. Not loud, hysterical sobs, but a quiet, shaking grief for everything she had lost and everything she had endured. Chaza didn't try to comfort her with words. He just sat with her in the firelight, his solid presence a silent anchor in her storm, letting her cry until there was nothing left but the quiet sound of their breathing. I don't belong anywhere, she whispered into the darkness when the tears were spent. He shifted closer. You belong here. She shook her head. You don't have to say that. You're just being kind. I'm not saying it for you, he said, his voice a low rumble. I'm saying it for me. She looked up then, her tear-stained face illuminated by the fire, and in his eyes she saw it. Not pity, not kindness, but a raw, undeniable truth. A need that mirrored her own. He reached out then, his calloused hand gently cupping her face. You're not a burden, Sarah, he said, his thumb stroking her cheek. You're a fire, and I have been cold for a very long time. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. This wasn't about being saved anymore. This was about choosing to stand and fight. This was about choosing him. She turned her head, her lips brushing against his palm in a gesture that was more intimate than any kiss. The choice had been made, the line had been drawn, but outside, in the darkness of the woods, other choices were being made, and the fire they had just ignited inside the cabin was about to be met with a very different kind of flame. Someone else had decided that if they couldn't have Sarah, no one would, and the smell of smoke was already beginning to drift on the wind. The smell hit her first, acrid, sharp, and wrong. It was the smell of pine burning too fast, of something intentional and violent. Sarah dropped the basket of kindling she was carrying and burst out of the cabin into the brittle night air. Flames. They were licking at the base of the east wall, thin orange tongues tasting the dry wood, growing bolder with every second. Chaza! Her scream tore through the night. He exploded from the small barn, already moving, a wild, primal fury in his eyes. He was barefoot in the snow, his hair flying behind him, a man transformed into pure, instinctual action. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved as one. She scooped up armfuls of snow, throwing them against the wall, the intense heat stinging her face. He used his own heavy winter coat, the one he wore for hunting, beating at the flames with a desperate rhythmic force. The fire hissed and spat, fighting back, a living, malevolent thing. For one terrifying, breathless moment, she thought they were going to lose. The flames climbed higher, reaching for the roof. But then, with a final, furious series of blows from Chaza, the fire choked, sputtered, and died, leaving behind a black, smoking scar on the side of their home. The danger was gone, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Chaza stood panting, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the dark, silent tree line. His jaw was set like granite. They were watching, Sarah said, her voice a raw whisper. They waited until they thought we were asleep. He didn't answer. He just dropped the smoking coat, picked up his hatchet, and started walking towards the woods, barefoot, armed with nothing but a small axe and a righteous rage that was hotter than the fire they had just extinguished. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran after him. They found the tracks easily in the fresh snow. 4 sets of them, heavy boots. They had come close, done their cowardly work, and fled back towards town. Chaza knelt, his long fingers tracing the edge of one of the prints. 4 of them, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. 3 of them are clumsy, drunk. He paused, pressing his fingers deeper into another track. But this one is steady, deliberate. He's the one who led them here. He looked up at Sarah, and his eyes were filled with a cold, terrifying light. And I know this print. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold snaked its way down Sarah's spine. He knew who did this. This wasn't just some random act of hate. This was personal. They returned to the cabin, the silence between them thick with unspoken threats. Sarah carefully relit the fire inside the hearth, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the match. Chaza began inspecting the charred wood of the outer wall. "We'll need new siding," she said, stating the obvious, needing to break the terrible silence. "I'll get it tomorrow," he said. "You're not going alone," she stated, her voice firm. "I'm not staying here, waiting." His eyes met hers across the small room, and he gave a single, sharp nod. "I wasn't going to leave you." The next morning, they rode into town not as victims, but as avengers. Sarah wore a simple green dress, a dress her late husband Elijah had disliked, a dress Millicent had once called too proud for a childless woman. She wore it like a declaration of war. Her hair was neatly braided, her coat was open, and her eyes dared anyone to meet her gaze. They didn't go to the general store. They didn't go to the blacksmith. They went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Orville Grant was leaning against a post outside, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He was a lazy, complacent man who valued peace over justice. He saw them coming, and a smirk touched his lips. "Well, well," he drawled, not bothering to stand up straight. "Looks like the winter's got folks real confused about where they belong." Sarah stepped forward before Chaza could speak, her voice ringing with cold fury. "Someone tried to burn our cabin down last night, Sheriff. 4 men. Their tracks led straight back to this town." The sheriff shrugged, unimpressed. "You got names?" "No," she admitted. "But I'd wager a few of them are regulars at the saloon. I'd wager you know exactly who they are." "Lots of men drink at the saloon," he said, spitting a piece of tobacco into the dirt. "And lots of folks in this town don't take kindly to arrangements like yours." The insinuation was clear. She had brought this on herself. That's when Chaza's voice cut in, calm, but carrying a weight that made the air crackle. "We're not asking the town for its kindness, Sheriff. We're asking you for the law." Orville Grant finally pushed himself off the post, his eyes narrowing. "Don't think you'll find much of either one of those things here, son." It was the final betrayal. The law in Dry Creek was just as rotten as the hearts of its people. But Sarah had been preparing for this. She had one last card to play, an ace she had been holding in her hand, waiting for the right moment. She reached into an inner pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was the Bible page Millicent had thrown at her on the day she was cast out, the one she'd kept without knowing why. But this time she didn't just see the scripture. Tucked inside its fold was another document, something Elijah must have hidden there, knowing his mother would never desecrate a holy book by looking too closely. "What's that?" the sheriff asked, his curiosity piqued. Sarah unfolded it. "It's a land deed," she announced, her voice strong and clear. "My husband Elijah left it to me. The North 40 acres, well beyond the edge of your town, beyond your reach." The sheriff's jaw dropped. The North 40 was considered wild, untamable land. No one had lived there in a generation. "What are you going to do with that?" he scoffed. "We," she said, stepping back to stand shoulder to shoulder with Chaza. Are going to build. You and him? Grant asked, incredulous. Yes, Sarah said, her chin high. Me and him, and any children we are blessed enough to raise. The sheriff let out a short, ugly laugh. Don't think the town will take too kindly to that. A new settlement of your kind, on their border. Chaza took one slow step forward, looming over the smaller man. His voice was quiet, but it held the promise of thunder. Then the town can learn. They turned and walked away, leaving the sheriff standing speechless in the middle of the street. As they passed the schoolhouse, the door opened and the teacher, a kind woman named Altha Boone, gave them a small, respectful nod. A few other townsfolk looked on, their expressions a mixture of shock, fear, and a grudging new respect. The power dynamic of Dry Creek had just been fractured, right in the center of town. But Sarah knew the deed wasn't the only secret Elijah had hidden. Tucked in with it was a letter she hadn't yet had the courage to read. She had a cold, sinking feeling that the truth about the fire, about Millicent's hatred, about everything, was written on that page. And it was a truth that could either build their new future or burn it to the ground before it even began. That afternoon, they packed the few belongings they had. There was nothing left for them at the edge of Dry Creek but ash and hatred. They walked north, leaving the town and its suffocating judgment behind them. They crossed the frozen river and passed through the ancient grove of juniper trees, following the directions on the old map. They found it. The North 40. It was wild, open country. A vast expanse of rolling hills and thick pine forest, covered in a pristine blanket of deep snow. The sky above was a brilliant, aching blue. It was empty. It was untouched. It was theirs. But before they could begin to build, Sarah knew she had to face the ghost of her past. That evening, as they sat by their first campfire on their new land, she finally pulled out the letter from Elijah. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Chaza sat across the fire from her, watching, giving her the space she needed. The letter was short. The handwriting was shaky. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then my greatest fear has come to pass, and my mother has shown her true colors. I am so sorry. I was a coward. I should have stood up to her years ago. The truth is, the North 40 was meant for us. It was our escape. I was going to tell you the week I died, but there is something else you must know. My mother's cruelty is not just born of grief. It is born of guilt. The day the tree fell, it was no accident. We were arguing. I told her we were leaving, that I was taking you away from her influence. She grew enraged. She pushed me. I stumbled. I fell down the ravine into the path of the falling timber. She just stood there, Sarah. She watched it happen. She let me die. The man who leads the others, the one who hates you so much. His name is Jedediah Kane. He was my mother's foreman. He knows the truth. She paid him for his silence. He helps her because he believes the land and everything on it should have been hers. He will not stop coming for you. Be careful. Trust the man from the woods. I spoke to him once. He is a good man, better than me. Forgive me. Live. Elijah. The letter fell from her numb fingers. The world tilted on its axis. Millicent. It wasn't just hate. It was murder. She hadn't just cast Sarah out. She had tried to erase the last witness to her unforgivable sin. And Jedediah Kane, the steady footprints Chaza had recognized. It all clicked into place, a horrifying mosaic of greed and lies. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock and horror, and met Chaza's gaze across the dancing flames. She didn't have to say a word. He knew. Jedediah Kane, he said, his voice a low growl. He had known the name all along. He has a debt to pay. Suddenly, a new detail from the letter surfaced in her mind. Trust the man from the woods. I spoke to him once. You knew him, she whispered. You knew Elijah. Chaza nodded slowly, his face grim in the firelight. We were not friends, but we spoke. He came to me a month before he died. He was afraid of his mother. He asked me, if anything were to happen to him, to look out for his wife. It all made sense now. His immediate acceptance of her, the silent way he had protected her. It wasn't just charity. It wasn't just kindness. It was a promise, a deathbed vow he had made to a man he barely knew. The weight of it all was staggering. But underneath the shock and the grief, something else was taking root. A cold, hard resolve. Millicent and Kane hadn't just tried to burn down her home. They had tried to steal her future. "She's not going to win," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. "They are not going to win." Chaza stood up, the firelight casting his shadow long and menacing against the snow. He picked up his hatchet. "No," he said, his eyes fixed on the darkness in the direction of town. "They're not." The fight for the North 40 had just begun, and it wasn't just about building a home anymore. It was about claiming justice. The world was theirs to build. Day by day, they carved a life out of the wilderness. The work was brutal, relentless. Chaza taught her how to swing an axe, how to read the grain of a log before splitting it, how to notch the wood so it would fit together snug and tight. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. Her body, once frail, became lean and powerful. He moved with an economy and grace that was breathtaking, felling massive pines that had stood for a century. She worked beside him, clearing brush, hauling timber, learning the rhythms of hard, honest labor. They were a team, their movements becoming synchronized, their silences filled with the comfortable understanding of a shared purpose. One day, as they were raising the first wall of their new cabin, the log slipped. Sarah cried out as the immense weight shifted, threatening to crush her. In a blur of motion, Chaza was there, his body thrown against the log, his muscles straining, holding it back just inches from her. "I've got it," he grunted, the veins standing out on his neck. "Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped, her heart hammering. "I'm fine." He held the log steady while she scrambled clear. Later that evening, as she was tending to the deep scrapes on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the edges of the new wounds alongside the old scars, the air between them grew thick. "You saved my life," she whispered. "We save each other," he replied, his voice low. He turned, his dark eyes capturing hers. "Every day." The cabin rose from the snow-covered ground, a testament to their shared will. It was larger than his old one, with 2 windows that faced the rising sun. As they worked, they talked. She told him of her dreams, of the life she'd once imagined. He told her of his past, of the people he'd lost, of the government that had taken his land and tried to erase his culture. He spoke of the scars on his skin, each one a story of a battle fought, a pain endured. They were 2 broken halves of a whole, piecing each other back together, log by log. But the shadow of Dry Creek was long. One morning, Chaza found fresh tracks at the edge of their land. A single rider, Jedediah Kane. He hadn't come close. He was just watching, waiting, a predator circling its prey. "He's testing our boundaries," Chaza said, his hand resting on his hatchet, seeing how far he can push. The threat spurred them to work faster, harder. They built a sturdy fence around the cabin, reinforced the door, and kept a watchful eye on the tree line. The North 40 was their sanctuary, and they would defend it with their lives. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting the snow in hues of pink and gold, Sarah felt a strange flutter in her belly. She paused, a hand going to her stomach. It happened again. A tiny, unmistakable flicker of life. She didn't say anything at first. She held the secret close, a precious, fragile ember of hope. The world was dangerous, their future uncertain, but inside her, a new life was beginning. A life conceived not in bitterness and obligation, but in the quiet spaces of a shared wilderness, in the shelter of a love that had grown as strong and steady as the pines. A few days later, she knew she couldn't keep it from him any longer. They were sitting by the fire in their newly finished cabin, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the air. "Chaza," she began, her voice soft. He looked at her, his expression patient. "The fire they set," she said, her hand resting on her stomach. "They didn't just try to destroy our home. They tried to destroy our future." She took a deep breath. They failed. She took his hand and placed it on her belly. His eyes widened as the realization dawned. He stayed perfectly still, his large, warm hand covering the place where their child was growing. For a long moment, he said nothing. His face was a mask of unreadable emotions. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. It was the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire being. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He knelt before her, his forehead resting against hers, his hand still protectively on her stomach. "You have been carrying the light since the day you first came to my door," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Now, you carry a fire all your own, our fire." Spring arrived, and the world burst into a riot of green. The snow melted, feeding the streams and rivers, and the North 40 came alive. With the thaw came a new resolve. They would not hide, they would not live in fear. One bright spring morning they rode back into Dry Creek, not for supplies, not for a confrontation. They rode straight to the small, clapboard church. The preacher, a timid man named Reverend Michael, hesitated when he saw them, his eyes flitting from Chaza's scarred face to Sarah's gently rounded belly. But before he could open his mouth to object, Sarah's voice rang out, clear and strong. "We are not here to be judged, Reverend," she said, her gaze unwavering. "We are here to be married." The preacher swallowed hard, looked at the determined set of their jaws, and simply nodded. The vows were spoken under a pale blue sky with no congregation, no fanfare, just the sound of the wind in the new spring leaves and the quiet presence of Altha Boone, the schoolteacher, who had come to stand as their witness. When it was over, she pressed Sarah's hand, her eyes shining with tears of happiness for them. As they were leaving the church, hand in hand, a figure blocked their path. It was Millicent Greaves. She looked older, smaller, her face a road map of bitterness and defeat. She stared at Sarah's belly, then at the way Chaza's hand rested protectively on her arm. "So," Millicent rasped, her voice brittle, "you got what you wanted. You replaced him." Sarah looked at the woman who had caused her so much pain, and she felt nothing, not anger, not hatred, just a profound, empty pity. "No one could ever replace Elijah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you can't build a life on grief. You have to build it on love." She looked at Chaza, and the world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them. "Something you know nothing about." They walked past her, leaving Millicent standing alone in the street, a ghost of a past that no longer had any power over them. They rode back to the North 40, not as outcasts, but as founders, husband and wife, the creators of a new family, a new home, a new world. The fire that had been set to destroy them had only forged them into something stronger. It had burned away the past, leaving behind only the pure, unshakable truth of their love. Sometimes, the things that are meant to break us are the very things that end up saving us. Sometimes, the greatest tragedies lead to the most beautiful beginnings. For Sarah and Chaza, their salvation wasn't found in a town, or a church, or in the approval of others. It was found in the wilderness, in each other, and in the quiet, fierce promise of the fire they had built together. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and the power of love against all odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because you never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered in the wild heart of the past.